Hey, Jen, Max, we are going to have a more serious conversation today. So click away and watch something else if you're not ready for serious. But it is important to know some of these things about Mexico in general, and specifically La Paz. And so I've got Martin Goebel here, and he is the board chair of CERCA, which is an organization that's working on getting clean air in La Paz. And he's going to tell us all about the air in La Paz, but also somewhat about Mexico and how things work down here that might be different from the US, because the US and Canada have a lot of regulations, but that regulation then means the air is clean, the water is clean, all those things that you come to expect happen, but maybe differently down in Mexico. So I am definitely interested in clean air, and as is my wife. She used to work for EPA in the US, and now she's a consultant for them. But I heard from people down in the comments. I read all of those comments, and if a topic comes up, it might take me a while, but I will cover it. So we are talking about pollution because someone had come here and mentioned in the comments that they were really affected by the air pollution. And I haven't seen that personally, but I can see the smoke coming out of the smokestacks. So let's start out and just find out more about, like, what is the air quality like in La Paz?
The air quality in La Paz is okay. It's not great. I represent, as you said, an organization called CERCA, the Center for Environmental Quality and Renewable Energy. So yes, we're trying to improve air quality here and the quality of life in general. And we chose to work on promoting renewable energy and health here. And one of the first things we're trying to tackle is pollution, air pollution.
Okay.
And the air quality here is generally okay, except by installing a very large network of monitors. We now know that about 100 days a year, we're exceeding the Mexican air quality norms for Mexico City. And so the air quality is good for, let's say, 250 days a year, but for 100 days a year, not so good.
Okay, well, I don't know if you can compare that a little bit to the US. Like, the US standards and the Mexican standards are probably different. So how are we doing according to maybe US standards, if you have that?
I don't have that with me right now, but the US standards are very similar to the Mexican
so that's
standards.
good.
And in fact, I think the Mexican standards were patterned after some of the US standards.
Well, that's good. Good to know. Okay, so let's look at other places in Mexico then, comparatively. Mexico City, everyone knows Mexico City's got bad air. How are we doing La Paz versus Mexico City versus other places where there's monitoring or going on?
Well, that's a kind of a difficult thing to say, but it's a very good question. You would think that in a coastal city that has a lot of breeze, our air quality should be quite good. Mexico City sits in a big basin that's surrounded by mountains for the most part, and so they have a lot of inversions and things like that. Here we have very few of those. So you would think that air quality, even though cars, transportation, and these power plants out here would be, all that pollution they generate would be easily blown away from here. That happens a lot, but not as much as you think.
Okay, so that's good to know. One thing we were talking about earlier is there's not industry here in La Paz.
There's zero industry here, zero manufacturing industry in La Paz. We have a lot of commerce, and of course we have a lot of shipping coming in and out of here, because literally everything we consume here comes from the mainland of Mexico.
Yes.
We are in fact an island.
Yes.
Or similar to an island in the Caribbean or somewhere, because we're completely disconnected here from the national grid, which is why we have these huge power plants here.
And that is a really interesting thing that as people were talking about the air quality, I learned about this isolated island grid. Yet we're an island from commerce, so things do cost more here. But because there is no connection to the grid, we're like Texas, I guess, that managing the energy becomes more difficult.
Yes.
So one of the reasons I learned that, it was about solar power. It's frickin' sunny. We're walking down the Malecon right now. It's sunny here a lot. Solar power seems like an obvious answer. There's a humongous solar field that I've been to. What's the scoop on solar? Why aren't we just building solar farms everywhere?
Well, that's a really good question, and we should be. So that's the quick and dirty answer. We should have much more solar power. We have one early stage wind farm.
Yep, I
Just
saw that
north
one. Yep.
of La Paz. It generates about 50 megawatts, or can generate about 50 megawatts of power. And we do have a small, it's not a very big solar farm, as you say. It only generates somewhere between 20 and 30 megs.
Okay.
And those are the only power plants, alternative power plants, that have been permitted in the southern part of this state. There's a couple of little ones in the northern part of the state as well, but not very many.
So what you're saying is that solar farm, which looked humongous to me, is generating less electricity than the wind farm over there.
Yes.
So
That's correct.
interesting. So I guess theoretically wind is more efficient, or is it just land like per unit of area that you need to cover?
No, not necessarily. They're both very good alternatives because we have both. We have a lot of sun. In fact, we are the state with one of the best solar resources, as they say, in all of Mexico. So that bodes well for the future of solar here. And we have a lot of wind too. So with the two of those, and perhaps with geothermal energy down the road, we could easily have a whole renewable energy economy here. And partly because we are disconnected from the grid, the national grid. We should have that, but we don't yet.
Okay, so what's it going to take to get us to that point where, we're going to come back and talk about the pollution and the ugliness. But let's talk about maybe the solutions before we talk more about the problem. So what's it going to take to get this to be just to be little projects out of many big ones?
Yes. Well, it's going to take a lot of effort. And it's going to take a lot of knowledge on the part of all the people who live here, and the citizens who live here, and the residents who live here, including Canadians and Americans and foreigners who live here. We need to band together, become better informed, and start to really advocate for change here. And that's why CERCA exists. It exists in order to inform people, educate people about these connections between air quality and human health, between air quality and bad air quality generation and energy generation, and the need for change.
Okay.
And so CERCA is hopefully generating real civic awareness, and hopefully little by little organization between and among people to advocate for the change at both the national and state levels.
Okay, well, let's hate to kind of bring in politics, but technically, so Martin's you're a Mexican citizen, along with a U.S. citizen and a German citizen.
That's great.
Born to parents from those two countries, but born here in Mexico. You can talk politics. I'm not supposed to really talk much about politics, so
well, I'd like to clarify that.
Okay, yeah.
It is not true that foreigners can't talk politics. What foreigners can't do in this country is influence politics, election politics.
Okay.
You can, given that you are property owners, and many of you are visa holders, resident visa holders, you can be vocal about and contribute to organizations that are trying to bring about change.
Okay.
So there's a bit of a misconception that foreigners can't be involved, and voice their opinions and become organized, but you cannot be involved in election politics.
Okay, so my question, I guess, thank you for that, by the way, does involve election politics, because we're about to have an election here in Mexico, just like up in the U.S., and we have two female candidates. It'll probably be one of the two. There's another third guy off somewhere. What will national politics, how will that impact state of clean air and energy in Mexico?
Well, that's a good question. We hope that things will change. Currently, our president is very, he's very anti-renewable energy. He does not want any competition between renewables and either Pemex, the National Petroleum Company, or CFE, the National Electrical Company, because they're both monopolies of the government. And so he has literally tried very much to stop any proliferation of renewables. And we hope that'll change with the new president, whoever she is. We have two prominent women who are going to be vying for the presidency, in fact are right now. Both of them, interestingly, have interest and have studies, I mean, actual educations in renewables. Both of them.
Yes.
And so it bodes well, at least their educational background bodes well for the kind of future we envision and need here in Baja California Sur. So we're very hopeful that they'll bring about change. Now, one of the candidates is, of course, from the existing party, the president's party, Morena, and we'll see. It'll be challenging for her to change the policy that he has espoused all along, but we're very hopeful, and of course, many people are talking to her about the kind of change we need, at least here, if not also in the rest of Mexico. Xochitl, the other candidate, is very pro-renewables. She's come here to La Paz and talked about it, and we hope that whoever gets elected, and we are not a political organization, we are not partisan at all, but we're hoping that both of them will bring about the kind of change that we need here in Baja.
Yeah, it's so interesting to see this election from a renewable standpoint, because you have a climate scientist essentially running against a person who understands the economic impact of renewables. So, and the idea being that Tesla doesn't want to build a plant here if they can't run it on some form of clean energy. And so all the other corporations from the United States, it's going to really hurt nearshoring if there's not renewable energy for these companies to run on.
Yes, that's correct.
Dig into the nasty part. We're going to go back and forth from bad to good. But so let's dig into the bad about the power plants. So how many power plants are there? Where's the electricity going? What's going into the power plants to make this? Yeah, and maybe how can we start to change that? Well, you know, I'm going to back up. Transportation, you mentioned, is a problem, is one of the sources of air pollution. So are the power plants, but there's not really industry. So power plants versus transportation. Handle that first.
Okay. We believe, given our research, that about 43% of all the pollution here in La Paz is produced by the power plants.
Okay.
And a little over 50% is produced by the transportation fleet. Okay. Buses or cars or everything. The reason that happens is that Baja California Sur didn't become a state until very late in the game here in Mexico. And so there is still no what they call verification here, where cars have to go through pollution testing.
Yeah.
And the rest of Mexico, they do. So we have a lot of Mexico's second-hand, third-hand fleet ends up here. And that's true from the States, too. A lot of cars are imported from the United States to here because they're old and they're cheap.
Yeah.
So that, and because they don't need any verification or they don't have a lot of pollution controls in them, they are easy to buy and easy to use here because they don't require it. So that's one reason why cars here are more polluting than, say, anywhere else in Mexico or the United States.
Yeah. Let's go out on this and just kind of hang out for a bit out on this little pier here. That's interesting because that's one of the things I've even talked about, getting your car plated in South Dakota, because you don't have to have your emissions checked in South Dakota, and so you don't have to go back and forth with your car. So if you're, you can leave a car down here from South Dakota. So, interesting. So I guess we'll, maybe there'll be some. Are there any changes with that on the horizon?
We're advocating for both.
Okay.
Eventually removing and replacing these power plants.
Yep.
Little by little. It's going to take a long process and a transition. We're working on a transition plan right now. It's not an easy thing because Cabo and La Paz are both growing very, very quickly. So the amount of power needed to fuel that growth and provide that kind of power is huge and growing very fast. This state is the fastest growing, economically the fastest growing state in the country.
Wow.
Because of tourism growth and immigration from the United States and Canada.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot of people that want second homes here and or want their home here and leave their second home in the United States and Canada.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of people moving here. So demand, the growth of demand for power and water and many other things is growing very, very quickly here. So it's very difficult to say, let's just scrap these power plants and build something else. We have to do it in a slow, steady, but hopefully incremental way.
Okay. Okay, so actually I'm going to turn the camera around a little bit now. So yes, all of us moving here is definitely contributing to part of the problem. That's one of the reasons I want to do this video, because I want to figure out what's the answer for us, and that will be coming at the end. I did look into getting solar for my own property, and I'll tell you more about that by the end. But let's hear about what maybe the different power plants here, the different sources of generation, and what's the probability or the timeline for getting these power plants cleaned up, and also for the cars.
Transitioning the transportation fleet here is not an easy process either, because there are so many used cars in California and other parts of the United States that end up here, and also in the rest of Mexico that end up here. So there's a real market for used cars here. In fact, we have the highest per capita car ownership in all of Mexico here in Baja California Sur. So transitioning from emission-controlled cars to or I should say, emission-controlled cars that don't have emission controls on them is very difficult here. There's a real lobby for not doing it. So I can't tell you how long it's going to take, but there's a lot of people like you and me and many citizens who are becoming aware of the problems and are beginning to organize and advocate for change.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear how all these things are all connected together in terms of like, oh, there's a supply here and the demand is we're meeting the demand here for a supply of not clean cars from other places. I know they've been doing things with regularization of cars. Maybe that's maybe a little bit of a first step of getting cars all to have license plates from the government. But let's talk now about the power plant. Where is the fuel coming from for those, and what's the probability of getting that changed over or getting them cleaned up?
Yeah, slightly below 70% of all the power, electrical power generated in Baja California Sur comes from this power plant and one behind these hills. The rest of the power comes from much smaller sources in the north of the state, and of course, the solar plant that you referred to earlier, and this wind farm that you have. So, and about 60% of that power, the 70% I just mentioned, goes to Cabo. Because Cabo has no power plants, they, of course, think it's great that they don't have to generate it or suffer the consequences. Here in La Paz, we generate the power that they use, but suffer the consequences, the lack of clean air, basically. So we are also trying, CERCA is also trying to educate people from Cabo, the greater Cabo area, to help support the transition that we require or need here so that we all enjoy cleaner air.
Okay, so we have these two power plants that are very dirty, and we're going to talk about the fuel too, of what they're using, what they're burning to make this power. But what's the possibility then of getting those when the majority of your power comes from that, and the economy is growing and people are using more air conditioning? It seems like we'll never get away from these things. So I want to know what's the prospects there.
You ask very good questions. Of course, we're asking these questions of ourselves every single day. How do we transition from a majority of a dirty burning electrical grid to a much cleaner one? Clearly, we have to transition. There's no other way about it. We have some of the highest rates of cancer here in La Paz, and not just women's cancer, but children's cancer. So it's becoming known that cars and power plants are probably the source of that problem. Not the only source, but probably one of the sources. So it's becoming very, very much more known that we have to transition. How you transition is a real question mark. So we think that there has to be a transition plan, and we're trying very hard to promote a transition plan. The government has set up a transition plan committee. It hasn't produced a plan yet that we know of, but it's working on it. We are also trying to bring in experts constantly that can help us design and build microgrids. Microgrids are standalone systems for small communities and tourism developments that maybe can exist without tapping into the grid. So in other words, generate their own solar, wind, or geothermal power as they build and grow. So one of the solutions are microgrids. Other solutions are more solar, more wind, and maybe alternative fuel. So the government permitted a company called New Fortress Energy a few years ago. They built a wonderful power plant here that's an LNG power plant. It was built, it's ready to go, and its final permits have not been awarded yet because the government wants to own that power plant. And in fact, it now does own that power plant. But they, again, just like with the wind and the solar, they only will fire it up when they need peak power to meet the demand for growing power, especially in the warm months of the year. So we do have about 180 or so megawatts of alternative power, LNG, solar, and wind, but that's only just a little slightly less than a third of the entire demand for the state.
Okay, so I'm a little sad to hear that the natural gas plant that I thought was up and running isn't yet up and running, and that the solar power plant and the wind farms that we see out there aren't necessarily used all the time. It seems like you'd use the cleanest things all the time and fire up the dirty ones when you need extra. So I kind of want to understand what's going on there.
Right now, the way CFE, our national power plant, looks at it is that what they generate is much cheaper than these alternatives. And it's partly much cheaper because they're helping Pemex, the national petroleum company, get rid of a waste fuel that they can't use. So there are many power plants throughout the Republic of Mexico that use what we call combustóleo. It's essentially a bunker fuel that comes from the refining process that they have to get rid of somehow. And they ship it all over Mexico, including here, to burn and generate power of the kind that you see behind me here. So they regard it as much cheaper. Of course, in that cheapness is not included the what they call the indirect costs to citizens of that dirty power. I mean the health costs and the transportation costs and other costs that were really entailed by bringing that stuff here. So we do the rest of Pemex a big favor by burning it here, but it doesn't do us, the citizens and residents here, a big favor. Now, we hope that will change over time.
Okay, so another technology I've seen people talk about is scrubbers. And then this is, I think, something on every power plant in the U.S. Maybe you know about that because you spend part of your time up in Portland. So, yeah, what about cleaning up these guys so they can still burn the nasty stuff that they have an oversupply of? So it's almost very similar to that oversupply of cars from the rest of the mainland. So let's hear about other technology and how that might help, because these are some really big power plants, 70% of the power for pretty much the entire state or the southern half of it.
Most of these thermal power plants here do have scrubbers on them. However, they're not very well maintained and often not even turned on. So the fact of the matter is that the technology's there, it just isn't used as efficiently and effectively as it should be. So that's the easy answer. They cost money to turn on, to operate, to maintain, and it's cheaper not to turn them on and operate and maintain. So when you see a big dark plume here, it means the scrubbers are likely not on.
So yeah, just the other week, maybe 2 weeks ago, I was over at a friend's house in Comitan, and I looked across. There was a huge black cloud of smoke over the city that was coming from, it looked like one of the power plants or the landfill or something. So I want to understand and dig a little deeper into this topic of scrubbers and how power plants work, I guess, or how nasty power plants, dirty power plants work.
Scrubbers, of course, are a very important part of the solution. When you see that big plume that you just spoke of, it's normally when they are firing up these power plants, when demand starts to grow in the morning as people turn on their lights and their air conditioners in the morning after, or in the evening when they go home after work. There's peak demand, and that's when they have to fire these things up more. That's when you normally see the big black plume. The solution to those, of course, is scrubbers on the one hand. They could also be including or applying things like additives. Additives could help improve combustion, and of course, eventually transition from this bunker fuel to liquefied natural gas or natural gas. Well, all of these things are being looked at, and that's why we have the New Fortress plant here, because New Fortress wanted to begin helping with this transition, and that's why it's here. We could also retrofit those machines to that other kinds of fuels, and all of those things have been talked about over the last few years more and more and more. What we hope is that through the action of awareness building, education, organization, and outreach to residents and people who advocate for this, we can get CFE and the president and the policymakers to really advocate for more of this cleaner burning power.
So I was looking into solar for our house, and mostly the rates are highest, or maybe the rates, but the most you pay in electricity is in the summer, and that's when we're not here. So it wasn't really going to pencil out for us because it was, in the $10,000 to $20,000 range if we wanted batteries and all that kind of stuff. So, but I think what I'm hearing here is that all these things are little pieces that are being put into place so that in the future, the alternative energy infrastructure is here. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Well, we do have a number of companies here in La Paz and in Baja California Sur that will come to your house and give you an estimate and a design for a solar installation for your home. But right now, the national federal government is not encouraging people to do that because they want to continue selling this power to you. Down the road, we believe this is going to change. It's going to have to change because demand is growing so quickly, and building more of these power plants is very unpopular at the moment, partly due to the work that CERCA has been doing to make people aware of the kind of power, in this case, dirty power, that we're generating here. So while you can install and bring down your consumption of CFE power at the moment, if you want to install and get paid for the electrons that you may put in the grid by being connected to the grid, you will not be paid for it at this time.
Okay, let's get to the what can you do part. I want to hear, what is it? So you can put solar on your roof and you'll at least remove your impact, but what I was really hoping for is like cutting down, like doing my own little part here. It sounds like the microgrids might be happening and things like that, but what is it that each one of us can do? Being that most of us are foreigners, so our impact's a little different in the process.
The single most important thing you can do is, of course, watch your consumption, so you're consuming less if you can. Secondly is make it as efficient as possible, your home as efficient as possible. If you can install some of your own solar, do it if you can. The third and most important thing from our perspective is to join forces with us and join CERCA, support CERCA, and become an advocate, an educated advocate for change. And we very much encourage people to do that, and people are doing that. CERCA is www.cerca.org.mx, and there's a way for you to get in there, become informed. They post studies there all the time, results of the monitoring, and periodically events that we're going to do. The next event is April the 19th here in La Paz, and we can send you the information so you can send it to your viewers and listeners, because CERCA is producing a book of its results to date on that day. And of course, we would love to have you financially support CERCA if you are inclined to do so. And that is all on this website, cerca.org.mx.
Okay, that is great. This has been a really fun interview for me because I'm kind of nerdy and geek out on this stuff. So let me know down in the comments how you feel about this kind of like, we're not drinking margaritas, we're talking about the realities of life in Mexico. And a lot of what we've talked about was specific to La Paz, but a lot of it was just specific to the way Mexico works. Like the Pemex and CFE are across Mexico, and so these are issues across Mexico. So let me know in the comments down below. Also, if you have questions that are like follow-up or questions that are other questions about other things that you'd like me to do some research on, leave that down in the comments, and I will see you in another video. Check out these guys up here. Hasta luego.